feed sacks in the shed had been torn open again. Walter Duller noticed it the moment he stepped inside with his lantern, the smell of scattered grain mixing with the cool evening air. He was 56 years old, a farmer who had worked this land for 30 of those years, and he knew every sound this old shed made. Torn sacks were new. He set the lantern on a hook and crouched down, running his fingers through the spilled grain. Something had been eating here, and eating carefully, not like rats that left mess everywhere. Whatever this was had taken small bites, leaving neat little piles behind. Walter thought of raccoons first, then foxes, though neither matched what he was seeing. He decided he would sit up that night and watch, the same way he used to when Grace was still alive and worried about the chickens. Grace had been gone 3 years now, but her habits still shaped his days. She used to say that no hungry creature should be turned away from their land, whether it deserved to eat there or not. Walter still left the porch light on some nights, still kept a bowl of scraps by the back step, though he never told anyone why. That night he settled into an old wooden chair just outside the shed door, a blanket over his knees and a mug of tea going cold in his hand. The stars came out slowly, the way they always did on this frontier world, and the fields went quiet, except for the wind moving through the wheat. It was well past midnight when he heard the sound again, a soft rustling from inside the shed. Walter did not move. He waited, watching the doorway, his breath slow and steady. What came out first was small, no bigger than a barn cat, with skin like dark leather and a long tail that swept low along the ground. Its eyes caught the moonlight, 2 thin slits of pale gold. Walter's first thought was that it looked like something out of an old picture book, a tiny dragon pulled straight from a child's story. A second one followed, slightly smaller, moving with quick, nervous steps. It stayed close to the first, glancing around constantly as if expecting danger. Then a third appeared, the largest of the group, walking with a strange, careful confidence, sniffing the air before it took each step. Walter held perfectly still. He had hunted enough in his younger years to know that sudden movement would send them running. The 3 creatures crept toward the spilled grain, the bold one going first, tearing into the pile without hesitation. The nervous one hung back, watching Walter more than the food. The careful one sniffed at the edge of the pile for a long time before finally taking a bite. He watched them eat for almost 10 minutes, transfixed. They were not aggressive, not frightened enough to run at the small sounds he made shifting in his chair. When the bold one glanced up and locked eyes with him, Walter simply held still and let it look. After a moment, it went back to eating. When they finished, the 3 creatures slipped back into the shadows beyond the shed, moving together, the nervous one last to leave, its head turning back once toward Walter before it disappeared into the dark fields. Walter sat there a long while after they were gone, turning the tea mug slowly between his hands. He tried to think of what kind of animal could look like that. Nothing on this world resembled dragons, not even in old stories the early settlers had brought with them. Whatever these creatures were, he was fairly certain now that they were not native wildlife. He thought about calling Henry Vuss in the morning, his neighbor who used to work on fleet ships before retiring out here. Henry always knew more about what was happening beyond the farms than anyone else in the settlement, but Walter decided against it for the night. Whatever these creatures were, they had done no harm. They had only eaten a bit of spilled grain, the same grain the birds and mice took every week anyway. Before going inside, Walter walked to the shed and set out a shallow metal dish, filling it with a scoop of feed from an unopened sack. He placed it near the door, in plain sight, the way Grace used to leave food for strays on the porch step. It felt like the right thing to do, even if he could not explain exactly why. Lying in bed that night, Walter found himself smiling slightly at the ceiling, something he had not done in a long while. There was an odd comfort in the idea that something new had come to his quiet farm, something curious and strange, drawn in by nothing more than a bit of food and an open door. He did not know yet that this small choice, made out of nothing more than habit and memory, was the first move in something far larger than his farm. He only knew that he wanted to see if they would come back. The next morning, Walter walked out to check the dish before he even made his coffee. It was empty, licked clean, with 3 sets of small clawed footprints pressed into the soft dirt around it. He stood there for a long moment, looking at those prints, feeling something he had not felt in years. It was not fear, it was not even simple curiosity. It was the quiet, steady feeling of being trusted by something wild, and Walter decided right then that he would not do anything to break that trust. "You feeding wild animals now, Walter?" Henry Vuss asked, leaning on the fence post with a half-grin on his weathered face. He had walked over from his own farm that morning, drawn by rummers already moving through the small settlement about strange tracks near Walter's shed. Walter shrugged and kept walking toward the barn, a bucket of feed swinging from his hand. "Something's been coming around at night. Figured it's easier to leave food out than fight it for the grain sacks." Henry followed him, curious now. What kind of something? Walter did not answer right away. He set the bucket down and looked out toward the fields, remembering the 2 golden eyes catching moonlight the night before. "Small," he finally said. "3 of them, never seen anything like it." Over the following 2 weeks, the creatures returned every single night, and Walter began to learn their habits the way he once learned the habits of his cattle. The boldest of the 3 always came first, pushing past the others without hesitation, eating quickly and without caution. Walter started calling it, in his own head, the greedy one, though he never said the name aloud to anyone. The second creature was smaller and far more nervous. It rarely ate until the others had already started, and it startled at the smallest sound, a creak of the chair or a distant bark from a farm dog 2 fields over. Walter noticed it watched him more than it watched its food, its narrow eyes following his every movement even while it chewed. The third was the strangest of the group. It moved with a slow, deliberate care, sniffing everything before touching it, sometimes circling the food dish twice before finally deciding to eat. Walter found himself waiting for that one each night, curious what small test it would run before it trusted the food was safe. He never tried to touch them. He never moved closer than the wooden chair by the shed door, and he never brought anyone else out to watch, not even Henry, though word had already begun to spread through the settlement simply from the shape of Walter's footprints leading to and from the shed each morning. One evening Henry showed up again, this time with a serious look Walter had not seen on him before. He sat down uninvited in the second chair Walter had started keeping outside, a habit that had crept in without him quite noticing. "You know these things aren't normal animals," Henry said, his voice lower than usual. "I still have contacts from my fleet days. Word is creatures matching what you're describing have shown up on other frontier worlds too. Nobody knows exactly what they are." Walter kept his eyes on the tree line at the edge of his fields. "They eat, they leave, they don't bother anything. Doesn't much matter to me what they are." "It matters if they're scouts for something bigger," Henry pressed. "It matters if there's a ship out there watching everything you do to them. Some worlds that had visitors like this ended up regretting how they handled it." Walter finally turned to look at his neighbor. "And what would you have me do instead? Chase them off? Trap one and hand it over to some lab so folks in a city somewhere can cut it open and figure out what it's made of?" Henry did not answer immediately, and Walter took his silence as agreement enough. "I'm not doing that," Walter said simply. "Whatever they are, they came here hungry and I fed them. That's the whole of it as far as I'm concerned." Henry left that night without pushing further, though the worry stayed clear on his face as he walked back across the field. Walter sat alone afterward, watching the dark tree line, waiting the way he had every night since it all began. When the 3 creatures appeared that evening, something felt different. The nervous one, instead of hanging back as usual, crept a few steps closer to Walter's chair than it ever had before, close enough that he could hear its quiet, careful breathing. It did not run when he shifted slightly in his seat. It simply watched him, its golden eyes steady in the dark, before finally turning back to join the others at the dish. Walter did not move for a long time after they left that night. He thought about what Henry had said, about scouts and ships and worlds that had regretted their choices. He thought about Grace and the way she had never once asked what an animal might be worth before deciding to feed it. Whatever these creatures were Wherever they had come from, Walter found that his answer stayed the same each night he considered it. He would keep the dish filled. He would keep the chair outside. He would let them come and go as they pleased, without asking for anything more than the simple pleasure of watching something wild learn slowly that his farm was a safe place to be. The message came through on Henry's old fleet terminal on a rainy afternoon, 3 weeks after the creatures first appeared at Walter's farm. Henry read it twice before he grabbed his coat and walked straight through the mud to Walter's front door, not bothering to knock before letting himself in. "You need to see this," Henry said, setting a small data tablet on the kitchen table. Walter wiped his hands on a towel and sat down across from him, more curious than concerned. "An old contact of mine finally wrote back," Henry explained. "Took some digging, but she found records that match what you've been describing. There's a name for them, the Ilverin." Walter turned the tablet toward himself and scanned the short report on the screen. The words meant little to him at first, full of technical language about first contact protocols and species classification. Henry leaned forward and explained it in simpler terms. "The Ilverin are old," Henry said, "older than most of the species humanity has met out here. They're spacefaring and by every account powerful, but they don't make contact the way most species do, with ships and ambassadors and formal meetings. They test worlds first." "Test them how?" Walter asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer, given what had been visiting his shed every night for weeks. "They send their young out, unsupervised, to remote and undeveloped settlements. No guard, no ship in orbit that anyone can detect, nothing to protect them. Then they watch, from somewhere far enough away that nobody notices, to see how the locals treat their children." Walter sat back slowly in his chair, thinking of the three small shapes that had been eating from his dish every night, the bold one, the nervous one, and the careful one. He thought of how harmless they had seemed, how easily he could have decided differently. "And if a world fails this test?" Walter asked. Henry's face was grim. "Most do, based on what little is known. Some worlds capture the young for study. Some try to sell them or trade them for favor with other species. A few, according to my contact, have simply killed them out of fear the moment they saw something unfamiliar. Every one of those worlds lost any chance at contact with the Ilverin, and more than that, some of them paid a heavy price once the Ilverin realized what had happened to their young." Walter was quiet for a long moment, turning this new information over carefully. "So this whole time," he said slowly, "something out there has been watching my farm." "Likely so," Henry said, "which means it's been watching how you treat those three creatures every single night for weeks now." Walter looked out the kitchen window toward the shed, visible even through the rain. He thought about how simple his choices had felt at the time, filling a dish with grain, sitting quietly in an old chair, letting curious young creatures learn on their own that his farm was not a place to fear. He had never once thought of it as being tested, and somehow that made him feel steadier about it rather than more nervous. "Does this change anything for you?" Henry asked, watching him carefully. Walter shook his head. "Why would it? I wasn't feeding them because I thought something bigger was watching. I fed them because they were hungry, and it cost me almost nothing to help. That reason doesn't change just because I know more about where they came from." Henry studied his friend for a long moment before a small, tired smile crossed his face. "That's probably exactly the answer that's kept you from failing so far, whether you realized it or not." That night, Walter sat in his usual chair outside the shed, the dish filled as always, though his thoughts were different now than they had been the night before. He found himself looking past the shadows near the shed, out toward the dark sky above the fields, wondering if somewhere far above the clouds, something ancient and patient was watching him as closely as he was watching the three young creatures below. When the bold one, the nervous one, and the careful one finally emerged from the tree line, Walter felt no different toward them than he had the very first night. He watched them eat, watched the nervous one glance toward him more than the others, and felt a strange, quiet responsibility settle over him that had nothing to do with fear. Whatever this test was, whatever world he was being measured against, Walter decided he would keep doing exactly what he had always done. He would not change his farm, his habits, or his kindness simply because he now understood there might be a much larger audience watching how the story unfolded. 3 official vehicles rolled up Walter's dirt road on a bright, windless morning, kicking dust high into the air behind them. He was mending a fence post when he saw them coming, and something in his gut told him this visit would be different from Henry's usual walks across the field. A woman stepped out of the lead vehicle first, dressed in a clean grey uniform that looked entirely out of place against the dust and crops of Walter's farm. She introduced herself as Director Susan Wren from the Regional First Contact Bureau, and behind her, 2 more officials climbed out carrying equipment cases Walter did not recognize. "We understand you've had visitors," Director Wren said, her tone polite but pointed, the kind of politeness that expected quick cooperation. "Small creatures appearing nightly, is that correct?" Walter set down his hammer slowly. "Word travels fast out here. Faster than you might think, especially once a name like the Ilverin gets mentioned in the wrong report," Wren replied. She glanced toward the shed, her expression calculating. "We would like to observe one of these creatures directly, Mr. Doyle, perhaps secure a specimen for closer study. This could be an enormous opportunity for humanity, being among the first to gather real data on a species this significant." Walter felt something harden in his chest at the word specimen. "You mean capture one?" Wren did not flinch from the correction. "I mean study one under controlled conditions. If we can understand more about the Ilverin before any formal contact occurs, it strengthens our position enormously. This is bigger than one farm, Mr. Doyle. This could shape how an entire species views humanity." "I understand exactly how big this is," Walter said evenly. "That's exactly why I'm not letting you touch them." Wren's easy politeness thinned slightly. "With respect, this isn't simply your decision to make. The Bureau has authority to intervene in matters of first contact significance, and this qualifies." Walter looked past her toward the shed, thinking of 3 golden eyes glinting in moonlight, of the nervous one that had crept closer to his chair than it ever had before, trusting him a little more with each visit. He thought of Henry's warning about worlds that had failed this same test by trying to capture or exploit creatures just like these. "They're not experiments," Walter said. "They're young and scared half the time, and they've done nothing except eat a bit of spilled grain on my land. If you want to understand the Ilverin, maybe start by not grabbing their children the moment you find them." One of Wren's assistants stepped forward, equipment case in hand, clearly ready to move toward the shed, despite the tension building between Walter and the director. Walter moved without thinking, placing himself directly between the assistant and the shed door, his arms crossed, his stance immovable. "This is my land," Walter said, his voice quiet but absolutely firm. "Bureau authority or not, nobody is stepping foot in that shed today." Wren studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing whether to escalate the confrontation in front of the small crowd of neighbors that had begun gathering at the edge of the property, drawn by the sight of official vehicles. Henry stood among them, arms crossed, his expression openly hostile toward the visitors. "You understand the significance of what you're risking," Wren said finally, her voice lower now. "If the Ilverin judge this world unworthy because one stubborn farmer refused reasonable scientific cooperation, that failure falls on everyone here, not just you." Walter did not back down. "Seems to me the surest way to fail their judgment is exactly what you're trying to do right now. Grabbing something that trusts you the moment it becomes useful to you isn't cooperation. It's exactly the kind of thing that gets a world marked as dangerous." The standoff stretched on through the afternoon, neither side willing to move first, until the gathering crowd of neighbors made it clear that forcing the issue in front of so many witnesses would create exactly the kind of incident the Bureau claimed it wanted to avoid. As the sun began sinking toward the horizon, Wren finally ordered her team back into their vehicles, though her parting words carried a clear warning that this was not over, that she would be watching closely, and that the Bureau would return if the situation changed. Walter stood at his fence line long after the dust from their vehicles had settled, Henry finally walking over to stand beside him in silence. Neither man said much, but Walter felt a steady certainty settle over him as darkness crept across the fields. Whatever happened next, whatever the Ilverin decided about this world, he was not going to be the reason it went wrong. That night, when the three creatures finally emerged from the tree line, they moved more cautiously than usual, as if sensing the tension that had filled the farm earlier that day. Walter sat quietly in his usual chair, the dish filled exactly as always, and slowly, one by one, they approached to eat, trusting him just as they had every night before. A low sound woke Walter before dawn, deeper than thunder and slower, a kind of pressure in the air more than a true noise. He sat up in bed instantly, years of farm instinct telling him something was wrong, or at least something enormous had arrived nearby. He pulled on his boots without bothering with a coat and stepped outside into a night gone strangely still. The wind had stopped completely. Even the insects, which usually filled the darkness with steady noise, had gone silent. Walter stood on his porch, scanning the fields, until his eyes settled on a shape near the tree line that made his breath catch in his chest. It was massive, far larger than anything he had ever seen, easily the size of his entire barn, its long body coiled low against the ground, as if trying not to crush the crops beneath it. Scales caught what little moonlight there was, deep bronze and shadowed green, shifting slightly as it breathed. Two enormous eyes. The same pale gold as the three young creatures he had come to know so well, turned slowly toward him across the field. Walter did not run. He was not entirely sure his legs would have obeyed him even if he tried, but more than that, some quiet instinct told him that running would be the wrong choice entirely. He walked forward instead, slowly, the way he always approached anything wild and uncertain, stopping a respectful distance away. The great creature lowered its head toward him, close enough now that Walter could feel warm breath moving across the cool night air. It made no sound, no growl, no threat of any kind. It simply looked at him, studying him the way he had studied its young every night for weeks. Walter found his voice eventually, though it came out quieter than he intended. "You're their mother, aren't you?" The creature's head tilted slightly, an almost human gesture of acknowledgement, and Walter understood somehow, without words passing between them, that he was right. This was the elder mother of the three young creatures who had been visiting his shed, and she had come to see for herself what had become of the test she had set in motion weeks ago. Images began forming in Walter's mind then, not quite thoughts of his own, gentle and careful, as if the great creature was reaching into his understanding rather than forcing anything upon him. He saw himself through unfamiliar eyes, sitting patiently in his old wooden chair night after night, filling a simple dish, never once reaching for the young creatures who came to eat. He saw the confrontation with Director Wren replayed, his refusal to allow anyone near the shed, his body placed deliberately between danger and the creatures he had chosen to protect. She has been watching everything, Walter realized, standing very still as the images continued, every single night. The images shifted again, and Walter saw briefly, painfully, glimpses of other worlds, other farms and settlements not unlike his own, where young Ilverin had been met with fear, greed, or violence instead of patience. He understood then exactly how rare his simple choices had been, and exactly how much had rested on something as small as a dish of grain and a willingness to sit quietly in the dark. The elder mother lowered her massive head further, until it rested gently on the ground beside him, an act of trust from a creature that could have crushed his entire farm without effort. Walter reached out slowly and placed his hand against the warm scales near her jaw, feeling a low, steady vibration beneath his palm that might have been the closest thing to a purr from something this size. When she finally rose, drawing her great body up and back from the field, something small and gleaming remained on the ground where her head had rested. Walter approached carefully and found a single egg, smooth and heavy, its surface a deep, warm gold that seemed to catch and hold what little moonlight touched it. He understood, somehow, without needing words explained to him, exactly what this gift meant. The Ilverin did not offer such things lightly, and Walter suspected very few worlds in the long history of this ancient test had ever been trusted with something like this. The elder mother lifted into the night sky with surprising grace for something so enormous, her great wings pushing air down across the fields hard enough to bend the wheat flat in wide circles beneath her. Walter watched her rise higher and higher until she vanished entirely against the stars, leaving behind only silence, stillness, and the golden egg resting warm against the cool earth at his feet. He knelt there a long while afterward, simply looking at it, understanding that everything about his quiet life on this farm had just changed in ways he could not yet fully measure. Word of the golden egg spread through the settlement faster than any harvest report or weather warning ever had. By the second morning, half the town had found some excuse to walk past Walter's farm, slowing their trucks along the dirt road just to catch a glimpse of the shed where the strange visitors had first appeared weeks earlier. Henry arrived before breakfast, letting himself in without knocking as usual, and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway at the sight of the egg resting on a folded blanket in the center of the table. He stared at it for a long moment before finally speaking. "You know what this means, right?" he said quietly. "This isn't just a gift, Walter. This is the Ilverin choosing to trust humanity, and they picked you to be the one holding that trust." Walter poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table toward his friend. "Didn't ask for that particular honor." "Doesn't matter now," Henry said, shaking his head slowly, words already moving up the chain. "My old contact says the regional office is in an uproar. Nobody expected first contact to happen like this, quietly, on some farmer's kitchen table instead of through official channels." As if summoned by the conversation itself, a familiar gray vehicle rolled up the dirt road later that same afternoon. Director Susan Wren stepped out alone this time, her earlier confidence noticeably softened. She stood at the edge of the porch, clearly waiting for permission before approaching further, a marked change from her first visit weeks before. "Mr. Doyle," she said carefully, "I understand there have been significant developments." Walter studied her for a long moment before stepping aside and allowing her onto the porch. He gestured toward a chair, and after a moment's hesitation, Wren sat down across from him, her earlier authority replaced by something closer to genuine uncertainty. "The Bureau has received formal contact," she admitted, "not through any official channel we established. Through you. The Ilverin have made it clear that any future relationship with humanity will run through this farm first, and through your judgment specifically, before anything else moves forward." Walter nodded slowly, unsurprised by the news given everything the elder mother had shown him. "Then I suppose you'll be needing my cooperation after all," he said, a small trace of dry humor finally creeping into his voice. Wren had the grace to look embarrassed. "I owe you an apology for how I approached this the first time. I was thinking about advantage and opportunity. You were thinking about doing right by something helpless. Turns out your instinct was worth considerably more than mine." Walter accepted this simply, without gloating, the same way he accepted most things on his farm. He was not a man built for holding grudges, especially not when there were larger matters now resting on his shoulders. That evening, as the sun sank low over the fields, Walter carried the golden egg outside and set it carefully on a soft bed of straw near the old wooden chair where everything had begun. He sat down beside it, coffee in hand, and waited the way he had every night for weeks now. The 3 young creatures emerged from the tree line just as darkness settled fully across the farm, though tonight they did not move toward the feeding dish first. Instead, the bold one, the nervous one, and the careful one approached the egg directly, circling it slowly, their golden eyes catching the last light of dusk. Walter watched them settle around the egg in a loose half-circle, close together in a way they had never quite arranged themselves before. It struck him then that these 3 might not simply be random visitors after all, but perhaps siblings or something close to it, gathering now to wait alongside him for whatever came next. A faint sound rose from within the golden shell, a soft, rhythmic tapping that made all 3 young creatures go suddenly still, their attention fixed entirely on the egg between them. Walter set his coffee aside and leaned forward, watching a thin crack spread slowly across the smooth, golden surface. He thought of Grace then, of her simple rule about never turning away a hungry creature, a rule that had somehow led from a torn feed sack to this quiet, extraordinary moment beneath the stars. Whatever emerged from that shell, whatever came next for his farm, his settlement, or even humanity as a whole, Walter understood that it had all started with something remarkably small and simple. He had only ever done what felt right, night after night, without expecting anything in return. As the crack widened further and the first hint of gold light spilled out from within the shell, Walter Doyle found himself smiling in the